All right, folks, in chapter 6, we're going to look at social structure and theories that are based in how social structure impacts crime. So, sociological theories analyze arrangements within society, which is social structure, how institutions, individuals, and groups, other social processes affect socialization and how that impacts our behavior. And they also look at power relationships. Now, psychological theories are using a micro approach. We're looking at an individual. These are using macro approaches, and they stress behavior likely exhibited by group members instead of predicting the behavior of specific individuals. There's three categories of theories here. Social structure theories. Crime is the result of an individual's location within the social structure of society. Social process theories are basically looking at social processes, especially socialization and social learning. And conflict theory says crime is the product of class struggle. So social structure theories explain crime by looking at economic and social arrangements within society. And both those formal and informal arrangements between different social groups are the root causes of crime and deviance. It also really highlights these social arrangements that contribute to low socioeconomic status, and basically that this is really our significant cause of crime. So these theories view members of lower socioeconomic groups, those who are disadvantaged, as being more likely to commit crime. And it sees the economy and social disenfranchisement as a fundamental cause of crime. So basically, crime is seen largely as a lower class phenomenon. So there's three types of social structure theories: social disorganization, strain theory, and cultural conflict theory. So let's look at those. Social disorganization is an ecological theory. Human ecology is the interrelationship between humans and the physical and cultural environments in which they live. The idea here is that the community as a functional whole directly determines what the quality of life is for the people living in that community. This theory starts at the University of Chicago and therefore is often referred to as the Chicago School, and begins at the start of the 20th century. So really it sees social change, social conflict, and lack of social consensus as the root causes of crime and deviance. Now, as I mentioned, this is the Chicago School, and it really takes the social ecology, as Ecological School of Criminology really develops there. And it's linking the structure and how our society or community is organized to its environment. And it looks at what we call social pathology. So it compares society to like a physical organism and sees crime as an illness or a disease. Now, this starts with Park and Burgess, who look at concentric zone theory, and they viewed cities as having 5 concentric zones. Each zone has unique characteristics and populations, and residents of inner zones tend to migrate to outer zones as they get better jobs, have more money. Here you can see these zones. Okay, so this is in other cities, zone 1 is called the Central Business District, but in here it's the Loop because they're looking at Chicago. Then around that is a zone in transition, working class zone, residential, and commuter zone. Now, Shaw and McKay apply this to juvenile delinquency, and they found that the rates of offending remain relatively constant over time within particular zones, even though the people that are coming to America and living in that zone are changing over time. So they concluded then that delinquency is caused by something to do with those communities, as opposed to characteristics of the immigrants themselves. And this develops the idea of cultural transmission, that these traditions, these values of delinquency are transmitted through each generation of people living in the same area. So, key contributions from this ecological school: the claim that society in the form of community has a major influence on our behavior, and they formalize the use of official crime and population statistics and ethnographic data. Now, another theory here is the criminology of place. It's often referred to as environmental criminology, and it emphasizes the importance of your geographic location and the features of that area and how they're associated with victimization. Now, pattern theory is often referred to as hotspots of crime. Specific crimes are associated with specific geographic areas and the characteristics of those areas. So, for instance, one thing they found was that 3% of all locations produce 50% of all calls for service in Minneapolis. This leads to the idea of policing those hotspots. If we know that there are particular areas responsible for 50% of all calls, and we can concentrate our police resources there, we should be able to make a very serious dent in crime. And that's called place-based crime prevention. Now, Stark talks about the theory of deviant neighborhoods and says that when neighborhoods are dense and poor, those homes are crowded. When homes are crowded, people move outside to congregate, talk, hang out. They tend to move then to places that have circumstances that raise temptation and offer opportunities to deviate. Crowded home means less supervision of children. Reduced supervision means poor school achievement, reduction in the stakes in conformity, and an increase in deviant behavior. Poor, dense neighborhoods are mixed use, and mixed use increases familiarity with and easy access to places offering opportunities for deviance. That mixed use just means that it's not strictly residential. It's residential and business and commercial all at the same time. Now, broken windows theory expands upon this and says that when a neighborhood is physically deteriorating, and we see this increase in unrepaired buildings, and they're using the analogy of a broken window, that we see increased concerns for personal safety. This leads to further decreases in maintenance and repair and increases in delinquency, vandalism, and crime, which causes further deterioration. Now, this drives the people in the community indoors and sends a message to everyone else that a neighborhood is out of control. Now, one way we can address this is through what's called defensible space. These are mechanisms that come together to bring an environment under the control of its residents. Now, location can be just as predictive as crime as the lifestyles of the people living there. And places can be criminogenic because they have certain routine activities associated with them, or they provide characteristics that facilitate crime. This leads to the concept of CPTED, crime prevention through environmental design. This is based on the idea that offenders look at whether or not they're going to commit a crime in a particular location after they evaluate the physical features. This means that architects can use CPTED to plan and design public areas to reduce opportunities for criminal activity. Now, one problem with this is that spatial displacement can become a problem. So, are we really getting rid of that crime, or are we just moving it to a new location? Now, some critiques of ecological theories. They tend to overemphasize the notion that space determines crime and delinquency. It's often unable to differentiate between the condition of social disorganization and the things that condition causes. It also doesn't explain why crimes occur outside of socially disorganized areas. Now, building off of social disorganization is this idea called collective efficacy. And it basically refers to the ability of residents to produce social action to meet their goals. So it's basically how the community can come together to advocate for what they need in order to keep their community safe. This idea that social interaction between residents can create that sense of cohesion and common interests. Now, strain theories are a different type of theory. They see delinquency as a form of maladaptive problem-solving behavior, and usually it's committed when people are frustrated or angry. So strain just refers to the pressure we feel to reach socially determined goals. Now, the classic statement of strain theory is first offered in 1938 by Merton, and Merton's talking about anomie. Anomie is the disjunction between our approved means to success and our legitimate goals. So legitimate goals include things like having a good job. Not having a good job. It includes things like having a home, having your vacations, wealth, status. But we also, as a society, say there's certain ways to get those things, right? Education, hard work, and saving. But those are not available to everybody. So crime basically becomes an alternative mean to success if you feel strain or pressure to succeed, but you don't have the necessary tools to do so. One complication with this theory, though, is that not everybody accepts the legitimacy of those goals. Now, another theory here talks about state stress index, and this is the measure of stress for every state and region in the United States. Now, researchers looking at this found that states with higher homicide and suicide rates had higher levels of social stress, which just sort of makes sense. And the effect of inflation on the change in the crime rate is positive and significant. So basically, as inflation increases, crime increases. Now, another concept here is relative deprivation. And this is the gap between rich and poor people who live close together. So it doesn't even have to be very rich people or very poor people. But we basically assess how well we're doing and where we stand in society by the people near us. Things and people we already know. Now, this relative deprivation creates feelings of anger, frustration, hostility, and social injustice. So you might see people who, have more money, things seem to come more easily to them, and you might feel like you deserve that as well. Now, this is also linked to this idea of distributive justice. It's our perception of our rightful place in the reward structure. And even wealthy and socially privileged people can feel this deprivation if they're around people who have more than them. Now, general strain theory is formulated, I believe, in 1990, and it's reformulated by Agnew. And he sees general strain theory as law-breaking behavior as a coping mechanism that enables those who engage in it to deal with socio-emotional problems generated by negative social relations. All right, what does that mean? Basically, there's three sources of strain. Someone gets in the way of your positively valued goals. You're working hard to get your degree, and for some reason you have to drop out of school and you can't continue. Someone removes positively valued stimuli that you possess, or someone presents negative stimuli. And you can read these in much better print in your book. So what happens is then people experience that strain and they get angry and they might cope in a negative fashion, and that negative fashion might be criminal. So what do? We could try to reduce strains conducive to crime. We could alter them to make them less conducive to crime, remove people from exposure to strain, or equip people with the traits and skills needed to avoid strains conducive to crime. Now, this expands our traditional strain theory. It widens the focus. It says strain has a cumulative effect. So after we reach a certain point, each additional piece of strain, even if it is not large itself, creates a problem. It gives us a more comprehensive approach, and it fully describes the factors affecting the choice of delinquent adaptations to strain. Now, Agnew sees the crime-producing effects of strain as cumulative. As I just said, each piece builds up together, and therefore chronic or repetitive strain creates a predisposition for delinquency. Now, the key thing here with strain theory is anger, fear, negative emotions. If someone is in particular angry about the stress they're experiencing or the strain they're experiencing, then they're much more likely to cope delinquently. Now, all strain theories share at least two central ideas: negative relationships with others, and they also argue that adolescents are pressured into delinquency by that negative affective state, so anger, fear, etc. Now, critiques here: original strain theory is probably less applicable to our modern society because of efforts towards improving success for everyone. But recent studies have also found that delinquents do not report being more distressed than other juveniles. Now, here's our other group of theories. Our third group of theories is cultural conflict, okay? Sometimes referred to as cultural deviancy. And it basically says that crime is caused because we have different groups in society and they have different values or they've been socialized differently. Now, Celine said the cause of crime was found in different values about what is proper behavior. So conduct norms are shared expectations about how we should behave in our personal life, and we acquire them very early. Now, this clash of norms between different socialized groups can result in crime. Now, Celine said there's two types of cultural conflict, primary and secondary. Primary results from a fundamental clash of cultures, so something like honor killings, whereas secondary conflict results from clashes between smaller cultures in the primary culture, or subcultures. Basically, middle class values tend to dictate the norms for our society here in America. So, subcultural theory talks about these subcultures. A culture is a collection of values, ideas, beliefs, and traits that characterize a human group, American culture, for example, and then there's subcultures. So these are the collection of values and preferences to smaller groups. They differ from the larger group in that they claim allegiance of smaller groups of people, but they also subscribe to the larger culture. Now, Miller outlined focal concerns. He basically looked at delinquent subcultures and talked about what are their 6 key focuses. Okay. One is trouble. How much trouble are you in? How did you get out of trouble? Staying out of trouble. The other is toughness. How tough are you physically? Can you fight? Can you hold your own? Smartness is the third one. This isn't book smarts. This is street smarts. Excitement is sort of pursuing that adrenaline rush. Fate is the idea that you do not control your own destiny. And autonomy is the idea that you want control over yourself. Now, Sykes and Matza talk about drift, and they say that offenders are aware of conventional values and understand their offending is wrong, and that they tend to drift in and out of delinquency. And when they do so, they use techniques of neutralization to justify their bad behavior. So let's look at these, okay? One is denying responsibility. It's not my fault. Denying injury. They're so rich they'll never miss it. Nobody got hurt. Denying the victim. I only beat up drunks. They deserve it. Okay, these are some of our original, and appealing to higher loyalties. We have to protect ourselves. Those are the 5 original ones. Okay, then we have some other ones. Everybody does it. It's not really deviant. The metaphor of the ledger is the idea that you've done more good things than bad things, so they kind of cross each other out. Sorry, I forgot condemn the condemners is an original one too. They're worse than we are. They're all on the take. Who are you to tell me what to do? And finally, entitlement, which is the idea that you are entitled to behave differently. So as I mentioned, delinquents drift in and out of crime. And they use these techniques of neutralization to basically justify why they broke rules they actually believe in. This allows them to overcome guilt without being fully alienated from the larger society. Now, there's also violent subcultures. It's often referred to as the subculture of violence. And this is studied by Ferracuti and Wolfgang. Wolfgang is a very famous criminologist. He is my mentor's mentor. And basically, these folks are looking at how violence is a learned form of adaptation. Learning to be violent occurs within the context of a subculture that emphasizes those advantages. And not only does the subculture of violence say that violence is appropriate in certain or allowed in certain circumstances, it actually demands it in certain circumstances. I don't know why I can't pronounce words today. Now, another theory under this culture conflict idea is differential opportunity. So just like legitimate opportunities are not equally distributed in society, illegitimate opportunities are also not equally distributed in society. But in certain subcultures, they're seen as acceptable by the participants in that subculture. Now, this is a pre-existing subcultural path to success, not approved by the wider culture. And basically, it's the idea that, in some communities, gang members might be seen as normal. Now, the key elements of a delinquent act is that the behavior violates the basic norms of society and it evokes a judgment by criminal justice agents. Now, there's 3 types of delinquent subcultures according to this theory. Criminal, and this occurs when criminal role models are readily available. Conflict gangs, this is where participants seek status through violence. And retreatist gangs, where they basically kind of drop out of society, engage in drug use and alcohol use. Now, there's some key identifiable features of delinquent subcultures. So, acts that reflect that support of the subculture are likely to recur with great frequency. Access to successful adult criminal careers may result from participating in that subculture, and it gives its members behavior stability and resistance to control or change. Now, another thing that happens is this idea called reaction formation. Juveniles are generally held accountable to the norms of the larger society, and those expectations are often referred to as the middle class measuring rod. This has to do with expectations related to school, language, cleanliness, punctuality, neatness, etc. But not everybody is raised or equally prepared to meet those expectations, and juveniles who cannot meet these expectations may turn to delinquency out of status frustration. Now, then they may engage in what's called reaction formation. And this is the process that we use when we openly reject something we actually want but cannot obtain or achieve. Now, let's talk a little bit about street gangs. These often provide income for members through illegal activity. And probably more importantly, they contribute to a sense of family or belonging, especially for kids from fragmented homes. Now, criminal street gangs are actually generally loosely structured. There's a lot of transient leadership and membership. They have very simple codes of loyalty that they often do not follow. And members generally have informal roles within the gang. But they may also have ties to established prison gangs. Now, street and prison gangs have some pretty important differences. Prison gangs are generally organized and have to do with collective drug trade. They have strong ties which are brutally enforced, and much covert and secret behavior among prisoners who belong to gangs. Street gangs are less structured. They're based on fluctuating ties. They're less involved in organized drug trade and have members who engage in relatively overt behavior on the streets. Now, criminal street gangs become a major source of concern in the mid to late 1800s when New York City starts experiencing an epidemic of gang-related violence. Now, by the middle of the 20th century, gang researchers start focusing on the illicit activities of juvenile gangs in inner cities. And at this point, most of their crime is vandalism, petty theft, and turf battles. Now, the ethnic distinctions that created early youth gang culture are largely forgotten today. Modern gangs are very different. And according to the National Youth Gang Survey, gangs are present in about 30% of jurisdictions across the U.S. They also find that there are about 30,000 gangs across the U.S. with about 850,000 members. Over 1/3 of jurisdictions report gang problems, which is up from 25% in 2001. Now, gang activity tends to be localized and tends to follow a cycle. Nationally, this problem has changed over time. The growing number of gangs and gang members, greater availability and use of firearms, and greater gang presence in major cities across the U.S. Now, gang members are often involved in a variety of serious and violent crimes, and drug dealing becomes kind of a mainstay there. Criminal street gangs can rival other organized crime groups in terms of their scope, the violence they use, and their money-making tactics. Now, street gangs increasingly involved as facilitators of sex trafficking. And gang business can be big business. Criminal violence is more characteristic of large inner city gangs than of small town gangs. Now, gang affiliation refers to how gang members generally, what gang you belong to, and then how you identify that. And that's done through clothing, symbols, tattoos, jewelry, haircuts, and hand symbols. Now, this is saying the recent formation of girl gangs, but these go back to the 1990s. And it appears that girl gang members are not as well armed as their male counterparts. Some female gangs are affiliated with a male gang, and some are their own gangs. So like Latin queens and Latin kings are affiliated. And I've worked with some female gang members, and some of them are quite vicious. Now, Elijah Anderson writes this book called The Code of the Street, and it really talks about what street code behavior is. And while this is talked about under gang affiliation, it doesn't necessarily mean gangs. It's basically looking at street culture. And in street culture, a man's sense of worth is determined by the respect he commands in public. Anderson talks about decent families versus street families. And individuals who are streetwise learn to outsmart or hustle others while avoiding being hustled themselves. Now, gang membership can have serious negative consequences. Gangs commit over 3/4 of crime in some communities. Um, Negative outcomes are linked to prolonged gang membership, and that includes dropping out of school, early parenthood, and a lack of employment. Obviously, there's an increased risk of arrest, having a criminal record, and being incarcerated. Now, some states have specific criteria for classifying someone as a gang member. Something like a reliable source has to identify them, and they must display gang symbols or tattoos. Now, the Spergel model talks about community-wide gang suppression programs. And the OJJDP, which is the Office of Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention, also has a comprehensive gang model, and you can read more about both of these in your book. Now, in terms of these culture conflict theories, they may lack explanatory power. They're also what's called tautological. Tautological reasoning is circular reasoning. You're saying that someone is a delinquent, someone is a criminal because they're delinquent, and then you define delinquency as by criminal behavior. They're also criticized for being racist because many so-called violent subcultures are generally populated by minorities. Now, what are some policy implications of the first group of theories, social structure theories? They're going to emphasize social action, and that has included the War on Poverty, the Chicago Area Project, etc. And that wraps up this chapter.